Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Mitchell Moat, and I'm an extension agent here with the University of Tennessee and Tennessee State University Extension Program in Rutherford County. And it's my privilege this morning to spend the next few minutes with you talking about this topic of less to do lawn care. You know, some folks think that lawns are for using and for living on. And these are the people that want to spend time in and on their lawn, but not necessarily working and doing lawn care. So it very well could be these are the individuals that are more interested in this topic of less to do lawn care. Well, what does less to do lawn care mean? Does it mean doing less? In this photograph, you can see that the homeowner is certainly doing less lawn care. As a matter of fact, they don't appear to be doing any kind of lawn care at all. And the same thing is true in this example. The property owner is really slacked off on the lawn care, and the appearance of the lawn as well as the landscape reflects that. If you choose to go the route of just stopping doing lawn care, doing less lawn care, you need to be prepared to accept the consequences, though, I guess, because many locations do have ordinances that dictate that you must maintain, some minimum level of lawn care or, face the consequences in terms of fines and so on. Does it mean there's less to do in the first place? Okay, the simpler a lawn or a landscape is, the less care it requires to maintain it. And in this example, you don't see much in the way of landscape at all, just some lawn area out there. And so the maintenance is very simple. Okay, the maintenance is very simple. So if there's less to do, then there's less that needs to be done, correct? I agree with that. But also, if there are artificial elements in the lawn and landscape, this usually dictates that there's going to be less to do also. In these examples, we see artificial turf being used in place of conventional turf. So that does require fewer inputs to maintain that. But does it mean a combination of the two? I expect that for many people, they view less to do lawn care as a combination of both reducing the number of things that are done to the lawn and also reducing the number of things that need to be done. So doing less means you have lower or reduced inputs, and then the second part of that is less there is needs to be done, so you have lower or reduced maintenance. So let's take a look at these things just a little bit more. What are the different things that we typically do to our lawns? So if we're talking about reducing inputs, lowering the amount of inputs, doing less, so let's consider those things that have to be done in the first place. Obviously, mowing is a very, probably the most commonly done practice in home lawns, but you also have to consider the act of fertilizing the lawn and also irrigating, applying pesticides sometimes, aerating the lawn to maintain good vigor and health, and dethatching the lawn depending on the kind of grass that you have, again, to help maintain vigor and overall health of the turf grass population. Sometimes you might even consider top dressing with good organic matter to help improve the soil quality in that individual lawn. If you have a lot of trees in the lawn, then raking leaves gets to be an issue. That's one of those chores that have to be done as far as maintaining a home lawn is concerned. And then finally, tending the beds. That's another aspect of home lawn care and landscape maintenance that has to be considered. So we need to think about all of those things if we're going to reduce the amount of work that needs to be done in the landscape. But before we go any further, let's put the brakes on for just a second and let's consider whether or not the whole idea of maintaining a lawn on your piece of property makes sense in the first place. Does your place have what it takes to grow a turf grass lawn? I really believe that there are some folks that are doomed to failure from the very start, simply because their piece of ground, no matter how much effort, no matter how much resource they throw at it, just doesn't have the conditions necessary to consistently maintain a decent stand of turf grass. So the first step is to make sure that your lawn area does have what it takes, the minimum requirements to potentially successfully grow, a good ground cover, good turf grass covering on that lawn. So what are those minimum requirements? Well, you've got to have enough soil. Okay, you've got to have a minimum of 6 inches of soil. And that, again, that's just a bare minimum. That's not really enough. That's just a bare minimum. But if you don't have enough soil, then you're not going to be able to maintain a lawn out there with any kind of success over any consistent period of time. You just got to have enough root zone to store the water, to give the roots an opportunity to go down into the ground and develop a root system that can support those turf grasses during stress periods and so on. We all know what happens when you've got thin ground over an obstacle out in the lawn. In this example, you can see a septic tank. The grass around the septic tank is nice and green. The grass over the septic tank is dead. Why is that? Because that soil depth over that septic tank is so shallow, it just cannot support turf grass growth or other plant growth as far as that's concerned when it gets a little bit hot and a little bit dry. So you've got to maintain or have at least that minimum of 6 inches of soil depth. How do you know? You need to verify that before you start throwing money and resources into establishing and trying to maintain a lawn in an area. You can measure it with a soil probe. Not everybody has a soil probe, I understand that, but you can drive a rod or a stake into the ground and see how deep you can go before you hit an immovable obstruction. And then you got to have enough sunlight. It takes a minimum of 4 hours of sunlight throughout the course of the day to have a reasonably good chance of maintaining a turf grass lawn. And so those two things, soil depth and sunlight, we can't do a whole lot to manage those. We either have enough or we don't. We're not going to increase soil depth a great deal. We're not going to increase the amount of sunlight that piece of property gets in most instances to any great significance. Moisture obviously is important, soil nutrition is important, and freedom from excessive competition from other plants and wear and tear. Those play into it as well, but we can manage those things. But we can't manage the soil depth, and we can't necessarily manage the amount of sunlight it gets. So you've got to make sure we have those two things before we go any further in trying to establish a lawn. But let's say we do determine that our property has enough soil, and it doesn't get enough sunlight to do this. So how do we get started with Let's Do Lawn Care? Well, typically, something has to change in order for us to get started on this journey to Let's Do Lawn Care. It may be that your expectations need to change. You cannot expect a pure weed-free golf course like carpeted turf if your idea is to practice Let's Do Lawn Care. So in some cases, your expectations have to change. It could be that your attitude has to change. Your attitude about what constitutes an acceptable lawn. If it stays the same, then the whole idea of Let's Do Lawn Care is not going to be feasible for you. And then possibly the turf grass and the landscape plants that you use to constitute the turf areas in the landscape may also need to change. Some plants are able to better perform with fewer inputs and less maintenance than others. Some turf grasses can perform and survive under stressful and lower input conditions than others can. So how do we get started? First step is to reduce the lawn area, right? That just makes sense. We're going to have Let's Do Lawn Care, we reduce the amount of lawn out there. Well, I don't know if that's necessarily true. Consider maintaining an established lawn versus maintaining, for example, a perennial border, the amount of time it takes to do that. Mowing once or twice per week versus weeding or mulching or deadheading and watering of that perennial border, those perennial beds out there. Does it really take less time to tend to the bed versus the mowing? Mowing is a very efficient practice because you can cover lots of ground in a hurry with a lawnmower versus doing a lot of handwork. That's just something to think about. Another factor to consider is, can you reduce lawn growth? If you can reduce the growth rate in the lawn, then you can reduce the frequency that lawn area needs to be mowed. How can you do that? Well, a way to lower or reduce your inputs is to fertilize less. This is an example of a UT soil test report. And if you send a soil sample to the University of Tennessee soil test lab and for lawns, and it comes back to you, you're going to have options. It's going to have fertilizer recommendations for different levels of desired quality. So if you want a really high quality lawn, then you're going to be fertilizing more. If you're not that much concerned about the quality, you want to go for the lower input, then you're going to be fertilizing less. So fertilizing less is a way to reduce the amount of the input and also help lead to Let's Do Lawn Care. The choices, the turf grass choices, the plants you choose to use in the lawn area, they can influence the amount of inputs it takes. I will say that of all turf grasses that are potentially used out there, none are perfect. Let's talk about a few of the characteristics of some of these very common ones. The first one you see pictured here is centipede grass. Centipede grass is a warm season turf grass. This is an example of Tiff Blair centipede. It was bred to be cold tolerant. This grass functions and thrives well under low fertility. Very little nitrogen fertilization is needed for a centipede grass. As a matter of fact, if you try to use the same level of fertility you would say for a high quality Bermuda grass lawn on a centipede grass lawn, then it's not going to thrive very well. It's going to show negative impact versus positive impacts. It is heat tolerant, but it's not very drought tolerant, but it does withstand the heat very well. Bermuda grass, on the other hand, has excellent heat tolerance as well as drought tolerance. It forms a nice dense turf. It does not have any shade tolerance. It's not going to grow in shady areas. It's a fairly cold tolerant grass. Not that often do we have winter conditions that will cause a dieback, actual death of Bermuda grass plants. It is potentially possible for us to do that some years, but typically we don't. This grass also has winter dormancy, as did the centipede grass. Any of the warm season grasses go into winter dormancy. So the fact that they go dormant at frost or after the first hard freeze, that can that can decrease the mowing season. So that leads to less to do lawn care, less maintenance required on those, because the mowing season isn't as long on warm season grasses typically as it is on the cool season grasses. Zoysia grass is another example of a warm season grass that we can realistically expect to grow under the right conditions here in our Middle Tennessee area. It's a creeping grass, just like Bermuda grass is, just like the centipede grass was. It's a very dense grass. It is drought tolerant. Some varieties do have more shade tolerance than does Bermuda grass. So if you do have some light shade in the lawn area, then zoysia grass might be an option you consider growing there. Just like the other warm season grasses, it does have that winter dormancy. And so with winter dormancy, you typically have a reduced mowing season. But then again, tall fescue, we talked about warm season grasses. Tall fescue is the most commonly used cool season turf grass that we're going to have here in our Middle Tennessee area. It can survive at low fertility. It's a bunch grass. It doesn't creep. It doesn't spread. It is a nice bunch grass. It's fairly, medium to coarse textured grass. It will survive at low fertility, but it does suffer from heat and drought. And it does have a longer mowing season because it does growth in the spring and it'll do growth in the fall of the year as well. So typically the mowing season for cool season grasses like tall fescue is longer. It does require water to maintain the high quality of tall fescue during hot, dry spells. You can see in this picture very plainly where the irrigation water landed and where it didn't, because it's all tall fescue pictured here, but the tall fescue pictured in the foreground is obviously suffering from drought stress, whereas that in the back part of the picture is still got a nice green color to it. Dutch clover, white clover, is a ground cover that could be used in the lawn area. It's a very persistent long ground cover. It does creep some, it does spread out, and it's a legume, so it does not need any nitrogen fertilization whatsoever. It doesn't grow really, really tall, and so therefore you may not generate as many clippings. You may not have to mow it quite as often as you might some of the other options out there, but white clover can be a decent option for you for cover in a lawn area versus a conventional turf grass. It might be that you can grow the white clover and say tall fescue together, because it is a cool season grass or a cool season plant. It does better growth in the cooler months of the year. Extended drought can damage the population severely, so that is a shortcoming of that particular grass. So if summertime green is really what you're after, there are some warm season grassy or weedy grasses or grass weeds that will survive in a lot of tough places under harsh conditions with no other inputs than mowing. Here in this example, you see some tall fescue and you've got some crabgrass growing in it. You know what? It's green, it thrives in the heat, and it doesn't take much in the way of input. The same thing is true of Dallas grass. It's certainly a different looking grass than most of the turf grasses that we try to maintain in our lawns. And if you're a turf grass purist, you don't want the crabgrass, you don't want the Dallas grass in there. But if what you're after is green color in the summertime, to give a surface out there to maybe reduce the heat some and slow down water infiltration, water runoff, then some of these wild grasses, if you will, these weed grasses, are going to do well under those summertime conditions. And they don't require any inputs, just mowing every once in a while. And then another plant that, again, a turf grass purist is not going to be in favor of, but it's wild violet, because this wild violet, it'll be green in the summertime and it'll grow in shady places where turf grasses won't tend to thrive. So it could be that if you're going to approach the idea of less to do lawn care, you might take advantage of some of these naturally occurring wild plants that are out there. When we're thinking about the idea of low reduced input, one of those practices that we typically perform on turf grass, as far as home lawn management is concerned, is irrigation. Well, if you're looking to reduce inputs, then you would also consider reducing the amount of irrigation that's supplied. There is a thing called survival irrigation. And the idea is that if turf grass is strong and vigorous, it goes into a drought, it should be able to stay in a drought-induced dormancy for 3 to 4 weeks without dying. So this suggests to you that you can reduce the amount of irrigation during the hot, dry periods. And you're not trying to keep the grass nice and green and growing necessarily with that high quality look, but to keep it alive so that when conditions do improve, that grass can take off and start growing again. Literature suggests that as little as a ½ inch of water per 1,000 square feet every 2 weeks or so can keep those grass crowns alive in a survival situation, keep them alive and just waiting until conditions improve. And then when those conditions do improve, the grass can take back off and start growing again, but you're still able to maintain that concept of reducing the amount of inputs, in this case, in reduced irrigation water. And just kind of a testament to toughness, these two examples, both these photographs were taken in a home lawn in Rockville, Tennessee in July of 2012. If you remember July 2012 here in the middle part of the state, we had a pretty hard drought as well as an extended heat spell. So you look at this picture taken on July the 12th, that's some pretty crispy looking grass out there, primarily tall fescue. But then it started raining in that latter part of July, and in that same spot on the 8th day of August in 2012, it's amazing how much of that grass survived. And you do see that additional green up in there. So that whole idea of survival irrigation, there is some merit to that, and you can practice reduced irrigation inputs and still keep that grass alive in the process of doing that. But we're talking about, is it necessary to reduce the amount of lawn area to reduce the amount of time you spend working on the lawn? Not necessarily so, but if you really do hate to mow, if you really do hate to mow, then maybe you ought to think about reducing the amount of area that needs to be mowed. And if you're like this fellow right here, you probably don't enjoy mowing all that much. So we talked about, doing less in the landscape, less mowing, less irrigation, less fertilization. Those are things that we can do. But what about, changing things so that less needs doing in the first place? So what steps can we take that will generate the need for lower or reduced maintenance practices? Well, so if the goal is less to do lawn care, consider the maintenance requirements of the different plants that are used in landscape beds, especially if you're looking at reducing turf areas by creating more beds. If frequent pruning is to maintain shape some of these plants is required, are you any better off in terms of having less to do? Are you actually reducing the need to do things? If you have to do lots of hand pruning to maintain those particular shapes, if you have to do lots of deadheading to maintain flowering in those plants that you have chosen to replace lawn area with, you think about those kinds of things. A nice landscape bed like this, you got a landscape bed out here, you got lots of nice trees, but when you add in the amount of leaf raking that has to be done, are you reducing the amount of lawn care that has to be done? Are you really making a big difference? Not necessarily so. But now there are maintenance examples that would probably lead to reduced need to do things. For example, the use of inorganic mulches. They don't decompose, they don't have to be replaced very often, and also not crowding plants so much in the landscape so that you don't have to do lots of hand weeding. If you have enough space between the plants in the landscape, it's possible to do your weeding with an herbicide if you choose to do so, versus all that hand pulling. Those organic mulches, again, don't go anywhere. They're going to maintain themselves for a long period of time. They stay where you put them. They don't degrade, and their appearance doesn't change very rapidly. So they require less maintenance work to maintain that particular appearance. Another example, using organic mulch. But the organic mulch is applied out there, and then the plants are spaced out so that it would be possible for an individual to use an herbicide versus hand weeding in order to keep those areas clean. So just kind of think about that when you're looking at installing plants to take the place of turf area. Now, we ask the question, is this landscape low maintenance or not? Remember, it may have started off low maintenance, but the more plants you add, then the more things there are in there to take care of, especially plants that require a fair amount of pruning and so on in order to keep them in a particular shape or particular size. So keep that in mind when you're looking at replacing turf areas with landscape beds, with landscape plants in those beds. Choose those that don't require as much pruning, as much annual work, just to keep them within a confined space or a certain particular shape, things of that nature. And also, finally, remember that low maintenance does not mean no maintenance. You certainly don't want to create an eyesore. Just the fact that you stop doing things does not mean it's low maintenance. But if you do have a landscape, a lawn of any sort, then maintenance is going to be required. Some level of maintenance is going to be required as long as you have growing plants out there. You know, mulching leaves versus raking leaves is a way to help reduce the amount of effort that goes into maintaining that lawn, that decreases the amount of time you spend on lawn care. Plus, you know, chopping those leaves up, mulching those is a great way to recycle those nutrients that are available in the leaves back into the lawn to help keep that fertility cycle going and reclaiming some of those nutrients not being lost. That would otherwise, if you just rake the leaves up, you know, and send them off to the landfill, etc. Or if you do rake the leaves up, you know, compost those, and then in turn use that to improve soil and landscape beds and so on. You know, in conclusion, when we talk about the concept of less to do lawn care, less to do landscapes, you decide what is less to do. Okay, does it mean less mowing? Does it mean reduced growth rate so there is less mowing to do? Do you choose a grass that goes dormant so that you don't have as long a mowing season? Do you decide that you're okay with having some weed growth in the lawn, so reduced application of pesticides? That's something that you can put into play. Remember, there's always more than one way to do things, and what works for you may work for someone else, or it may not work as well for someone else. And sometimes you just got to figure out what those things are. And finally, I guess the last thing to keep in mind is just don't create a health and a safety hazard. You know, if your community has regulations about certain levels of maintenance, don't try to fight that. You know, stay within those guidelines, and then just go out and enjoy your property. Well, folks, that's all that I have for you. I hope this was useful to you, and I hope you'll tune in next time we have one of these events. But until then, this is Mitchell Moak from the University of Tennessee and Tennessee State University Extension Program saying so long.